Good evening and welcome to all those watching this session on sovereignty from a women's point of view. Congratulations to the organizations of this conference, to Dudi Sada, Dudi Finkler, and the entire team of Besheva. You are right. We can't only live in the here and now. In order to be relevant today, we need a much broader and further vision. What is our vision? What are our goals? Are we ready with plans for tomorrow, taking a long-range view? This conference radiates faith. Yes, one day we will attain our vision, but only if we plan it. And based on that, the future will be sovereignty. Many of our friends tell us sovereignty is no longer relevant. The agenda has changed. You missed the boat. We'll wait. We'll wait for another opportunity. The thing is that that's not the case. We are here to say that sovereignty is relevant today more than ever. And our candidates from the right, please talk about sovereignty. Make it part of your work plans, and your level will go much higher. The new winds that are blowing from the U.S. are an important vector, but we believe that things are decided in Jerusalem. Sovereignty is yet another plank alongside settlement, deepening our hold, the hold of the Jewish people on the land of Israel. The Almighty will keep his promise. To you will I give this land, but we must act to take it and to preserve it with faithful hands. And now, on this woman's point of view, we're not feminists. Already in the book of Exodus, we see how women rallied for redemption. Women have a strength to move things forward under difficult conditions. For the existence of the nation, we've invited political women here, Orit Struk, Edith Silman, Michal Shir, who are faithfully leading forth the idea of sovereignty. Additionally, it's important for us to hear from Professor Talia Einhorn about the legal aspects of sovereignty, and Dr. Anat Roth from the Shiloh Forum, who are building plans for the future for Judea and Samara. We are happy that the Shiloh Forum is working on this. The sovereignty movement discovered a few years ago that we don't have a national master plan that includes Judea and Samara. We looked at the current plan, the Tama 38 plan, and we couldn't believe what we saw. Judea and Samara was empty, white, after 50 years that we've lived there. There's still not a national governmental master plan for Judea and Samara. There are specific plans that are put forward by mayors, but there isn't a coherent plan for cities, for roads, for ecology, for factories. When we saw that there's no plan and there's no preparations for such a plan, we here at the Sovereignty Movement prepared, together with a team of planners, a very initial plan for Judea and Samaria. We hope that in these elections, where the right-wing potential is over 80 Knesset seats, that the government that will be formed will prepare a master plan for our historic heartland and homeland. And now we'll move on to the panel moderated by journalist and writer Emily Amrusi. Thank you very much, Nadiu. Thank you very much, Judith. We'd like to open this women's panel, not just women, perhaps women and mothers do a great deal about sovereignty, and we are honored to open this panel with a very nice panel of people. We have Michal Shir, Professor Talia Einhorn, Orit Struk, a former Knesset member, and Edith Silman and Anat Roth, Dr. Anat Roth. And we'll start with you, Talia Einhorn. You're an expert on international law from Ariel University, have a very well-known reputation. I'd like to ask you about something that happened this week in the International Court in The Hague. What are the repercussions of that for us? The decision that was given was based on the Oslo process. If we hadn't had the Oslo process, we wouldn't have had that decision. Israel is not a party to the convention. The convention of the court isn't designed to deal with serious crimes like genocide, things of that nature. And they introduced at the last moment that settlement, the idea of settlement in occupied lands, the idea that these territories are of course not occupied. That's a different story, and I have written an article on that, and a number of other people and experts have written articles on that. For those who are interested, there is a lot to read on that. But Israel is not an occupier. In territories, these are territories that were given to it not only by the League of Nations, but also in the UN Charter. They were given it. But the moment they put that into the court, that settlement is a crime, Israel did not sign the charter and is not a party to the court. But then along came the Palestinian Authority that is not even defined as a state, but they created a new status for it. In other words, an observer state, not a member state, because the Security Council was unwilling to sign on to this new creature, this new creation in the community of nations. And the minority position says that this majority decision is really very problematic. And they are relating to the Palestinian Authority as if it is a kind of state. So first of all, we must condemn everything that it says, but that's not enough. The next step, which is very, very important, is perhaps to consider, after all, what does a person do who is in the middle of a minefield? He has to go out exactly the way he came in, because that path is apparently safe, one step at a time. And what it turns out is that this Palestinian entity, and it hasn't done anything even for the people, the Arabs living in Judea and Samaria. It has moved them backwards by generations, but it has also become dangerous to Israel's leaders and commanders, because the court talks about the personal criminal responsibility of the people involved. So we're told that a former prosecutor said that Israel has a year and a half to organize, and he thinks that we need to reach an agreement within that year and a half with the Palestinian Authority. But on the contrary, what we need to do is to organize, because the PIA only exists thanks to Israel's support. This panel is talking about Israel's future, especially from the point of view of sovereignty. Can you say something about the Abraham Accords? Has that reversed the situation? No, not at all. The Abraham Accords, we must say that that was a very, very wise step on the part of the Prime Minister, together with Jared Kushner and President Trump, of course. These agreements, their advantage, it turned the previous paradigm where Israel was told that it would not be able to reach an agreement without first reaching peace with the Palestinians. But it doesn't work that way. It's just the opposite. And what we have proved is that we do have allies in the Middle East. We have shared interests. Somebody created a rumor that some promise was made or a pledge was made by Prime Minister Netanyahu not to apply sovereignty. But you have to understand that according to international law, a unilateral commitment by a Prime Minister, it could have validity, but only if certain conditions are fulfilled. First of all, it has to be made publicly, and I have looked into all the agreements, and there is no commitment regarding sovereignty in any of them. Number two, It must be explicit and detailed enough so that we know exactly what he pledged. And number three, if there is a situation where it is possible to have a bilateral agreement, then for example, like in Burkina Faso and Mali, they had a border conflict and there was a declaration on the part of the prime minister, and they said, we don't care about that, because in a situation where there could have been an agreement between the two sides, then the declarations, a unilateral declaration does not apply and cannot be considered valid. So that is one issue. We have to be very concise. I would love to hear everything you have to say. And we have women here are concerned about the future, and they want to talk about the borders, but we can't talk about the borders and ignore something that is very closely involved, and that is the legal system. Could you talk about the necessary changes and reforms that are needed? The legal infrastructure in Israel today is unsatisfactory for a democratic country. And this relates to four main subjects. The first subject is the High Court of Justice. That process is something that doesn't exist in any Western democracy. Nowhere else do you get to the High Court of Justice as the first instance, without facts, without proof. So we have public petitioners who represent only themselves. They have not been harmed in any way. According to the court, everything is adjudicable. That has no boundaries whatsoever. And another thing that's unique to the High Court of Justice, they make their own rules. They talk about proportionality and reasonableness, these terms that have no meaning. What happened in Amona when they got to the administrative court, or the gas plan, there were no facts discussed whatsoever, and it was disqualified for reasons that are not usually acceptable in court. And the Supreme Court has the right to decide which judges will be on the panel. What needs to be done is to do away with the High Court of Justice, to move things to administrative courts, and there we need to see, and this is really something that's dangerous to the very existence of the State of Israel, where the High Court of Justice has taken authority, has arrogated authority to discuss the basic laws. In Holland, for example, there are countries where the High Court of Justice has no right, or the Supreme Court has no right to annul laws, and these things must be dealt with in an administrative course and no more High Court of Justice. The second thing is the matter of the Attorney General. This unique institution, I call it the fourth estate in Israel, because it's, or the fourth branch of government. There is no other country in which an Attorney General who's supposed to be an advisor forces his opinion on the government. The voice of the government is not heard. I know of no government, no democracy where the Attorney General makes those kinds of decisions and has that kind of authority. A third subject is the criminal code, and this is related very strongly to what we're talking about, where we have a case against the Prime Minister itself, but there are problems in all the cases. The criminal code here is not suitable for a Western democracy. And unfortunately, our timetable is not suitable to your vast knowledge. When I am a member of the International Comparative Law Forum, and I see that there are I blush when I look at what's happening in terms of comparative law. What we see here is that people are being trampled on here. Their rights are being trampled on. The public must be informed about this. Thank you very much, Professor Einhorn, former MK Orit Struk and hopefully a future MK and the head of the Eretz Israel lobby in the Knesset. After this terrible crisis that we've gone through, this health crisis, economic crisis, will sovereignty be discussed in the coming Knesset? I'm very happy to hear what Professor Talia Einhorn had to say, that it would be wrong to say that sovereignty did not pass because of the Abraham Accords. That is just nonsense. The question of whether there will or will not be sovereignty is dependent on us and on the next Knesset and nothing else. That's important to bear in mind. And also, as Talia said, if we've gotten this far with the International Court in Hague, why? It's all because of the Oslo agreements. If we hadn't created the Palestinian Authority and had the Oslo agreements, we would not have ended up in the International Court in Hague. It's true what Talia says, that we have to look at the Palestinian Authority as an entity that only harms Israel and stop strengthening it. It must be weakened as much as possible until it falls apart, as far as I'm concerned. It does nothing for us, and it's extremely harmful to us. And it's important to look at how we passed Oslo, because we're on the eve of elections, and I'm old enough to remember what happened in 1992. And I remember very well that in 1992, there was a person with very nationalist views, Raful, and he created a party with some anonymous people, and some of those people were discovered very quickly to be people who had no problem crossing the lines, and that's how Oslo was passed. There are too many candidates for the coming Knesset who are also free players who would have no trouble crossing lines. We don't know what their positions are, and that awaits us. And even more so, if we want to move towards sovereignty, we don't need to wait for anyone. It's wrong to say, as some of the parties do, that there's no way to apply sovereignty right now. But everything that is related to sovereignty, what is sovereignty? It's the opposite of withdrawal. It says this territory is ours, we're not withdrawing anymore, we're only moving ahead now. No more fake sovereignty as in the Trump plan, where on the one hand you apply sovereignty to part of the land and on the other hand you create a Palestinian state. No, sovereignty is only to move ahead. So we have a lot of construction, and the corona crisis in Judea and Samaria, this situation is the best. And we have the war over areas C, where we must fight for our state lands. And the Prime Minister, it's as if we're using a cap gun against a mafia. It's all dependent on how the coalition is formed. Every single day, we can see what Benny Gantz is doing to the coalition, how with his own hands he destroyed the possibility of formalizing the young settlement. Once he was in favor and then he became against. And what he's doing with the lockdowns and how we're dealing with the corona, we see a left-wing person right in the middle of the government, and we can't understand how there are parties with right-wing people at their heads, people who I appreciate and respect very much, and they are willing to sit in a coalition with the left. I don't understand that. How far can we go? We have President Biden to deal with. What are we doing to ourselves? Well, not only not have sovereignty, we may find ourselves, don't we remember what happened with Obama? We find ourselves facing the same threats as there. Can anyone assure that a Netanyahu government will apply government? Again, I'm saying, we say that you have first to distance yourself from evil and then move towards good. So we must have a great deal of construction and so on, but certainly we must not allow ourselves to be in a situation where coalition partners don't allow you to do it, just as we saw now. There was a government decision, a written decision. It was prepared, the formalization of the young settlements. Everything was prepared on paper. And who stopped it? Benny Gantz. So now to come and say that I'm going to have a government with Lapid or with Meretz, where is your national responsibility? So I'd like to apologize to the other panel members because I want to hear what Michal Shir has to say. And I hear more than a hint about your party. You were once in the Likud and now you are in New Hope of Gideon Sa'ar. The question is, how can you advance sovereignty if you're unwilling to sit in the same government with Netanyahu? Would you be willing to sit with those left-wing parties that were mentioned? How would you advance sovereignty then? So you're saying that if you're not willing to sit under Netanyahu, as if all the Netanyahu governments advanced sovereignty for 10 years, they did nothing about advancing sovereignty. And when we got to this historical moment when we could have applied sovereignty decided not to do it, to sell sovereignty in return for peace agreements. And that's with the friendly Trump government. And now we have a Biden government. And we don't know how he is going to function vis-a-vis Israel. It doesn't look especially good right now in terms of sovereignty. What about the young settlements? Gideon Sa'ar is in favor of sovereignty. When Orit spoke about the young settlements and Minister Britton, I fought for the young settlement. It began with that whole subject. Began with things that I did in the Knesset. Most of our list are people who are known to have worked to advance sovereignty. But beyond the application of sovereignty, there are a number of necessary steps that need to be taken. One is indeed, as he said, to strengthen settlement and to strengthen the young settlement, to strengthen our borders. That's critical, and it's not being done. None of the Netanyahu governments did anything about that. The Jordan Valley, all the borders there, and ultimately to speak the truth in any arrangement that they might try to coerce us to become a part of what determines other facts on the ground. And when I entered the Knesset and the Corona crisis began and I had to stop the process, the Israeli public, the center of the country, the periphery, the north and the south, they don't know where Judea and Samaria is. They don't know. They're not aware. Of course, true, we've undergone a process. Once we were considered right-wing extremists, those crazy people on the hill, that's not the situation anymore. But still, in the previous Knesset, I plan to continue in the next Knesset, and as the head of the sovereignty lobby, I want to have what I call sovereignty on the bar to promote accessibility to the concept of sovereignty so that people who live in Ramat Sharon should understand where Samaria and Judea are located. Can you imagine Yair Lapid, a potential partner for you in the government? Can you imagine agreeing to them? Can you see him applying sovereignty to the mountains overlooking Netanya? Anyone who joins our coalition under our principles, which are very clear on the subject of sovereignty too, they're very clear, are invited. During periods of crisis, Begin and Shamir had tried to have a government that's as broad as possible. That's the policy during times of crisis. So then you may be with Netanyahu in the same government. We never ruled out the Likud as a party. Under the leadership of Gideon Sa'ar, of course, that's possible. To sit under him, I think you've confused us with Bennett. We are not saying, we are criticizing a government which we consider a government that has failed in terms of Judea and Samaria, vis-a-vis the Obama government in freezing construction and the matter of sovereignty and in businesses and economy, and women who have gone 50 years back who are locked up at home because of the lockdowns. We see the governmental failures, but you can't criticize a government and then afterwards say, we're willing to sit under that government. No, we want to replace the current government. Gideon Sa'ar, we see that many people consider him a leader that can replace Netanyahu. And of course, we invite Bennett. We consider him a worthy partner to join us. On the contrary, a coalition that is as right-wing as possible, that is what we are striving for. Idit Silman, who is running on behalf of Yamina, formerly a member of the Jewish Home. Bennett is the leader of her party. What are the chances of seeing Hadar and the other soldier returned home from Gaza? I met with Judith and Nanya at the memorial site, and there's a great deal being done there. We have been working for more than 3 years right across the border from Gaza at the Black Arrow Memorial, and it's very, very sad that for more than 6.5 years our boys are still there. So what can the government do? The current government has done nothing. It is not using any of the tools at its disposal. They're sending them respirators, they're sending them vaccines and other things. We're talking about the principle of reciprocity. So those who are familiar, Talia knows international law. If we're talking about humanitarian help, but for not using those simple tools, and then there are much bigger things like freeing terrorists. Netanyahu had dozens of opportunities and very clear statements about returning the boys, and everything remained in the air. There are no actions, and we're seeing things being done that are very serious. The Golden family has had to petition the High Court of Justice time and time again to force the leaders of the country to do this very simple thing. Ultimately, we all know that the IDF is our army, and the most important thing is to return these boys home. And I pray that this will happen as soon as possible, and I'm sure that it will. I must move on to another subject, unfortunately, sovereignty. The head of your party, Naftali Bennett, says if it's not about Corona, nobody cares. And so with the great economic crisis we're going through now, people don't care about sovereignty. So how are you going to advance it? I heard my colleague, Michal Shir, who has criticized rightly the subject of Likud and the current government. But you can't, on one part, criticize and then work with people who came from that government. The chair of the major committees, on the one hand, you can't criticize and still remain in a place that you don't accept, and as my colleague said, say things that aren't clear to the public. For example, if you're not willing to sit with the Likud, and if you're not willing to sit with these or those, so who will you form a government with? With the left, with the Arab parties? And that's why we said we wouldn't sit under a Netanyahu government. We are not in that discourse. We are in a discourse of action. There's a situation now which is, of course, a very, very serious health and economic crisis. The flags that Naftali Bennett raises are not instead of other flags. They're alongside other flags. We never gave up on the subject of the land of Israel and sovereignty. Of course, we're in favor of it. And Ayelet Shaked has done a great deal in trying to formalize the young settlement. And our people are at the forefront of the struggle. Nobody can accuse us of not being there. But these flags need to stand alongside each other, not instead of each other. The most important principle of the Jewish people, when you look at the people, you say, yes, sovereignty, settlement, but it's also expressed in the very serious economic crisis, which is a once-in-a-century event. We're not in a situation where if it's not Corona, nobody cares. Of course, the Corona crisis is a very, very major element. I'm very happy to hear that. So we'd heard a commitment from Idit Silman that the flag of sovereignty has not been folded. You are the only one who is looking forward to the future. Can you say something about the master plan for the future? One of the big problems in Judea and Samaria, that in terms of the planning authorities, the hesitant approach on the part of the government to Judea and Samaria, it's not just that it hasn't applied Jewish law and sovereignty, as Professor Einhorn said. Ultimately, we are de jure sovereigns there on the ground, but we haven't applied Israeli law to Judea and Samaria. And this hesitance, on the one hand, where we are building settlements and we control the area thanks to a military government, a temporary provisional government. We say there are rights, but on the other hand, we leave all of the laws as they were. It creates confusion. You, as a member of the Kohelet Forum and Shiloh Forum, is there any mention of Judea and Samaria in the National Master Plan? This hesitation and this confusion has a lot of repercussions for the day-to-day lives of the people living in Judea and Samaria. Every time if they want to do any building at all, they have to have the permission of the general in charge. And it has repercussions for Israel's international standings, and it opens the door to those who wish to undermine our right to Judea and Samar. And of course, it has implications for other areas, one that you've touched on already, but I won't expand on it, and that is the lack of governance, the inability to enforce law and order in Judea and Samara. It's absolutely criminal what's happening on the ground. There is destruction of archaeological sites. We're completely losing heritage sites that are being destroyed. And of course, the Palestinian construction in Area C, the Palestinians are ultimately the Palestinians have already taken a quarter of Area C. They occupy it, and that's a matter of demographics. They don't build empty buildings to leave them empty. They live in them. In the Oslo agreements, since the Oslo agreements, the number of Palestinians in Area C has tripled. And there's talk about diplomatic issues. Another thing that's very important is that Judea and Samaria, in terms of the planning authorities, is not part of the State of Israel. It's not part of any official plan of the government. There's no future planning for the territory. No, when you're talking about transportation master plans, there was a draft of a transportation plan presented last year. It hasn't been authorized yet. There are still comments on it. But in this master plan, the view of what is going to happen in the future, the forecast of the planning authorities is that in 2050, there will be 750,000 Jewish people living there, which is a linear growth. If we don't do anything, if we look at the building starts and the processes that are occurring there, that's where we're going to end up. We're talking about 1 million. But if we look at the building starts, we're talking about 1,800 on the average each year. In other words, we're barely scratching the 750,000. In the Shiloh Forum, we're working on a strategic plan for Judea and Samaria in 2050. And this plan relates to all the aspects: transportation, employment, industry, tourism, settlement, everything. And it is planning that territory forward to see 2 million Jews living there in 2050. And that means another 700,000 housing units compared to 60,000 if we continue at the current pace. And if you like, I can expand on that. But generally speaking, we can say that the development and construction in Judea and Samaria today, whether it's good or bad, the only way it's being discussed is whether it's good for the two-state solution. We all understand there won't be two states, and everybody accepts that, whether they like it or not. That's the reality. And the question that needs to be asked is whether the development and construction in Judea and Samaria is good
for the State of Israel, and it is very good for the State of Israel. You mentioned that you can see Netanya from the mountains. First of all, it's good for Israel's economy, and it's the ultimate solution for Israel's housing crisis. In order to close the gaps in terms of housing, we need to build something like 400,000 housing units within 5 years. So we have here a huge territory we could build, according to our very detailed plan, where and how much, 700,000 housing units, and that could completely address this entire issue. And according to our plan, it would create another 400,000 jobs for Palestinians too, as well as, of course, for Israelis. And it supports high-tech, the ability to build industry there, mid-tech industry. Everybody talks about building high-tech to the south or to the north, but if there is mid-tech, which supports high-tech in Judea and Samaria, that will very much strengthen this industry, which is what is keeping our heads above the water. And of course, it will strengthen our commercial ties with other countries, and we want to see a free trade zone in the Jordan Valley. This is a territorial anchor which could open up commerce eastward to the various Arab countries in the context of the Abraham Accords. And of course, it provides jobs and raises the quality of life and standard of living of the Palestinians very significantly. And of course, will lead to additional moderation and stability, and it's good for the interests of preserving our national lands, our heritage sites, our natural resources. It's good for the State of Israel, not just good for the settlers. It's not a political issue. It's simply good for everyone living in Israel. Everyone will benefit from this process. Dr. Anat Roth, when you talk about 2050, I'd love to continue talking to you until then, but I'd like to say to the distinguished members of the panel that I enjoyed very much talking to you. If we could make up a government, form a government made up of these women, I'd like to thank all the members of the panel, Idit Silman and Professor Talia Einhorn, Michal Shir, and Dr. Anat Roth. To sum up, thank you to Emily Amirusi, the moderator. Thank you also to Orit, to Idit, Michal, Professor Talia Einhorn, Dr. Anat Roth, for showing us optimism, hope, and practical action in terms of sovereignty. For a whole hour, we didn't discuss the corona crisis, which hopefully will pass soon, and we underscored national value-based subjects that are not transient. We'd like to ask the government to place the subject of the land of Israel's sovereignty, a fair justice system, Jewish identity, and Aliyah at the top of their priorities.